Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Blogging Theology, where I'm very honored to have as a guest Dale Allison from the United States. Now, for those of you who don't know, if there are such people, Dale is an American New Testament scholar, an historian of early Christianity, and a Christian theologian who for many years served as a professor of New Testament exegesis and early Christianity at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. But now he is the Richard J. Dearborn Professor of New Testament Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary. And he's also an ordained elder in the Presbyterian Church in the USA. So that's quite a CV. So you're most welcome, Dale, to the program.
Happy to be here, Paul.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to share a few of the books which I personally have, which I do want other people to be aware of. Now, I call these my bricks. Now, these are commentary. It's a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, okay, which Dale has written. This is Matthew 1 to 7. You can see it's pretty thick. And then the second volume, 8 to 18, and another volume which takes you all the way to the end to Matthew 28. This is a huge. There we go. Now, many scholars, Jimmy Dunn, for example, who sadly passed away recently, sees this pretty much as the definitive scholarly commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, and it is absolutely extra. It's the go-to text for academics, of course, and for all students. Now, if you don't want something as heavy as that, Dale has produced this concise version. That's what it's called, the shorter commentary, which, as you can see, is much shorter, of the same text. He's managed to condense all of that into this. And I recommend both. This is really, really handy if you want a quick reference without all the Greek, perhaps, and so on. His most recent book is this one, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History, published in the UK back in just March, a few months ago. I don't know when it was available in the States, but it's certainly a new book. And I haven't read all of it. I hadn't had a chance to, but I've read bits of it. And there's one chapter I want to just discuss with Dale shortly. But before we begin all of that, actually it's one of my favorite books. And this is ultra slim, but actually it's ultra packed full of dynamite, theological dynamite. And it's called The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus. And this is a series of very fascinating reflections on the nature of biblical scholarship and Christianity and Christology, how to understand the Bible, and so on and so on. Very, very interesting. And I just wanted to start by quoting some of Dale's observations about, for several centuries now, there's been this academic discipline, scholarly discipline called biblical scholarship. Particularly since the Enlightenment has really taken off. But very few people, it seems, outside of this rarefied world are aware of the contents and the implications and the results of biblical scholarship. And he says on page 3 of this book, remarkably, many pew sitters are happily oblivious of what has been going on in the thinking world for 2.5 centuries. They have somehow avoided most or even all of the serious intellectual commentary on the Gospels since the Enlightenment. Perhaps typical of the two churches I grew up in, says Dale, one Presbyterian and one Congregationalist. Never in Sunday school or from the pulpit did I hear anything of the modern debates surrounding Jesus and the Gospels. And then a little later on, he says of people who, perhaps modern people who do hear perhaps through the media or through public broadcasting a little bit of what has been going on in the scholarly world. And then he says, these people may, for instance, fret upon learning that many modern scholars do not believe that Matthew wrote Matthew or that Jesus spoke the discourses in John. They may also, depending on their background, find themselves vexed upon becoming persuaded that the old props, miracles, eyewitness origins, the proof and prophecy, have seemingly fallen to the ground and are in need of being propped up or maybe abandoned as everlasting ruins. Such individuals have awakened from their dogmatic slumbers. I think it's a reference to Kant there when he's talking about Hume, and cannot go back to sleep. Wow. I mean, it's a great bit of rhetoric, actually. I mean, this is not dry and dust academic stuff. It's almost poetic in its and references there, I think, to Kant and so on. This is this not really a scandal that there is such a chasm between your world, but you're in a seminary, so you're teaching ministers and the pastors of the future, but the congregations at the lay level who don't seem to know much about this material.
So, in my experience, a lot of pastors get a seminary education and they forget a lot of it once they walk out the door. Let me give you a couple of brief stories here. I did have a student once a number of years ago, 15 years ago or so, come into my office, and he had been taking a class I was teaching on the historical Jesus. And he said, "Professor Allison, this is fascinating. I really, really want to learn this stuff, but I've decided I won't, because I'm a pastor and it won't work in my church and it won't go with my wife. So I'm walking away and I'm not going to pay any attention to it anymore." And from what I know of him, he did. He just walked away from it. He thought it was too challenging. I also knew another pastor who told me that he was very proud of the fact that he had gone to seminary and learned nothing. In other words, he wanted to walk out of seminary with exactly what he took in, and he gave the professors what they wanted on their tests, but he didn't believe any of it. Now, I'm just talking about the situation in America. I don't know what it is like elsewhere, but I will say that at least once a week, I do get a letter, an email from somebody who has discovered this new world of the quest, and they're panicked and they want guidance, or they'll tell me they discovered it and then became an atheist, but now they're rethinking things. Can I help them? And so on. But I get these heartfelt letters all the time, and they are almost all from people who grew up in very conservative churches, and then they discover this world that nobody ever told them about, and they feel cheated and they feel threatened, and they are often very, very confused. That was sort of my own experience, as I recounted at the beginning of that book. What happened to me is I was actually in a Methodist church, and in the Methodist church library, I was 16 years old, maybe 17, and I saw this book, and I saw the name Schweitzer on the cover. And I said, "What's that? I've heard of this guy. I don't know why. He's famous, and I guess he was a good person." I just pulled it off and said, "Whoa, I don't know any of this." And I read it. I read The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And when I put it down, I thought, this book is 70 years old. Nobody's ever told me about any of this stuff. I really felt, not that my parents had cheated me, but that my Christian education had cheated me, and my spiritual mentors had cheated me. And what happened was I had to figure things out for myself. I was completely on my own. We didn't have email back then, so I couldn't email anybody. Albert Schweitzer was dead. If he'd been alive, we'd had email. I would have emailed Albert. By the way, Albert tried to answer every letter that was written to him, even by high school kids. And he stayed up late at night without a secretary, writing by hand, responding to everybody. Anyway, so he would have responded to me, but he died in 65, so it was too late for me.
That's extraordinary stuff. I can imagine him, because he was a true polymath. I mean, he was a great organ scholar. He was a missionary. He worked in Africa as a doctor, as a missionary, as a doctor, a medical doctor.
Yeah.
So I visions of him sitting in Africa in the 1950s, writing these letters to students in America. I mean, what a guy! Extraordinary human being.
I think Albert Schweitzer is what I call a mutant. That is, he's advanced beyond us. He had a mind that most of us can only aspire to. He also had more energy, just pure physical energy, than anybody you'll run into. In his 70s, he's out there working on the roads, outside his hospital, lifting boulders and doing all this sort of thing. He's the pharmacist as well as the doctor. And he's still in the midst of all this. But I can tell you this. So I did know somebody who visited Schweitzer in 63 or 64, right before he died. He was still old. And this was a pastor from the States. And so he went over there to meet the great man. And he showed up, and he was there for dinner. And Schweitzer said, I want you to come back to my cabin at whatever it was, 9 o'clock or something like that. So the pastor goes back there. He gets to meet the world famous person. And this was the Methodist pastor. And what Schweitzer proceeded to do was to pull out a Greek synopsis, and try to convince this pastor that Matthew was the first gospel, not Mark. And I love this story because here you have this world famous man who still can't get away from the Gospels and the questions about Jesus. And in his old age, he's still going through his synopsis, trying to figure things out.
That's amazing. I like your quote. There's a quote at the beginning of the 4th chapter by William James, the great American psychologist. And he says, we instinctively recoil from seeing an object to which our emotions and our affections are committed, handled by the intellect as any other object is handled. And I got absolutely right. I mean, maybe this is the root of the problem, that people don't want, their sacred text treated like any other old text in the world, and they recoil from this. And that maybe is part of the reason why it's not caught fire with the population at large. What do you think?
I don't know. I'm not a social psychologist, so I don't really understand. So my case was like this. I discovered this area, this field of knowledge, and I had nobody to help me. So I went to the library, and then I went to bookstores, and then I got book catalogs, and I just read and I read and I read, and I was often confused, and I was sometimes threatened. But the truth is, this turned out to be a great intellectual and spiritual adventure, and I've had a great life, and I've had a great time learning, and a great time studying, and so for me, it's puzzling when people just want to stay where they are. I have friends, very good, close friends, whose theological thoughts today in their 60s are exactly the same as they were when they were teenagers. And I don't understand that. In every other area of life, you grow and learn and mature. But there's something about religion which makes a lot of people think, I just want to stay where I am, and anything else is bad or evil.
Can I suggest a reason why that might be a problem, though? Because, okay, you're a teenager or in your 20s, and you convert to a religion that has a central creedal affirmation of the Nicene Creed, say, that Jesus is God. He's the Son, consubstantial with the Father, or the Chalcedonian Creed. And then you study New Testament studies, and you learn, maybe from yourself or any other respected scholar, that it seems that Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, has used the Gospel of Mark in the writing of his own Gospel, and he has deliberately heightened the Christology that we find in Mark. For example, in Mark chapter 10, we read, a man came to Jesus and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replies, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone." And then we look at the passage in Matthew's redaction, his editing, and Matthew changes the words, and he has, "Well, why do you ask me about what is good? There's no one good but God alone." Seemingly, therefore, to mitigate or water down the implications of Mark 10, that Jesus is somehow not God. And that's one of many examples one could give. Now, the implication is that you have a trajectory, does it not, of accelerating or embellishment over time, from Mark to Matthew, and then let alone John, which has a very, very high explicit Christology. And this, the implications of this is not just ivory tower, is it not? It implies that if we rewind the clock backwards to the earliest Jesus tradition, you have a non-divine Jesus. You have a Jesus who said, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone." And then in John, you have, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was, I am," etc. So it is threatening, is it not, to that creedal faith the faith in Nicaea, Chalcedon, etc. It's not without a cost, a price that one pays.
No, so as a Christian, I would say it leads you to maybe reinterpret the creeds or view them in a new way. But it doesn't necessitate that you throw them away or that you pay no attention to them at all. Now, I agree with you that there is an evolutionary history here and a development. Actually, I was raised on the old standard German model, last half of the 20th century. So the model was this. This is what you find in Ferdinand Hahn's great old book, Titles of Jesus and Christology. So the pre-Easter Jesus is an eschatological prophet. That's an exalted position, but that's all it is. Yeah. Then after Easter, they decide he was the Messiah because he's risen from the dead. And once you have Davidic Messiah, then you can get some son language because there is sonship language associated with the son of David, 2 Samuel 7, the prophecy about Solomon, which was understood messianically. So I'll be his father, he'll be a son to me. Then you get son language. And then once you get son language, then that goes in all sorts of directions for all sorts of reasons. Then you end up with pre-existence. And then finally you end up with divinity. But you also must know there's been a pushback against that. And I'm not completely against that. The proponents of so-called early high Christology. Yeah. And I think that evolutionary process, if it's true, took place in a much shorter time period than I was taught. But Paul, here's the other. Oh, you're going to interrupt me before I go on.
I agree with you. I think we have a very high early Christology in Paul, which is then continued, if you like, with John. So I'm not simply saying early is low, high is therefore late. We have very high early, but I was talking about the Gospels themselves, really, the Gospel trajectory. But I think Paul jumps on to John. You have a natural, but the synoptics, the way we see Matthew editing Mark and the way John heightens even further in an unprecedented way, the I am sayings, which is not found in the synoptic tradition. There we have the trajectory, I would argue.
I agree with that, but I've never known. You can ask this question. Nobody has the answer, and I don't know. What would Matthew have thought if he had read John's gospel? Would he have thought, this is fantastic, or is this terrible, or I'm just confused by it? It's an interesting question. So one of the things, this doesn't change what you're saying, but maybe it adds a nuance. So let's take this idea of pre-existence. Yeah. So I don't know if you know Simon Gathercole. He's a fine scholar, but he's
here in Cambridge.
Okay. So he's a nice guy, but he's more importantly, he's a fine scholar. And so he wrote a book arguing that you can find pre-existence in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now,
I've read it.
He hasn't convinced most people, and he didn't convince me. Okay. Right. But here's the puzzle for me. Pre-existence, I think, is already there in Paul. Actually, I think it's in Philippians 2, and I'm with the crowd who thinks that the so-called hymn there, kenosis hymn, is pre-Pauline. So I think this notion of Jesus' pre-existence is pre-Pauline. I think it's very early.
Yes.
So what does it mean that it's not in Mark or Matthew or Luke, but it's clearly in John? Did these three evangelists not know this idea? I find that hard to think that all three of them were unfamiliar with it. I don't think these people live in isolated backwaters. I think early Christianity is a movement full of itinerants, and I think it's a fairly small movement, and I think people know what's going on everywhere. Just read the end of Romans. Paul's never been to Rome, and how many people does he know there? It's unbelievable, right? Mm-hmm. So did they not know this idea? Matthew's writing 85 or 90. It's been around for half a century. How can he not know it? So is it that all three of them didn't know it and rejected it? Or is it that all three of them knew it and it just doesn't come up at any appropriate place in the gospel? I do think you have to make a distinction, and this makes our work impossible, really, between what is in the gospel text and what an author thought. So you can't take Romans and say this is what Paul thought. even though it's sort of systematic and in some ways comprehensive and a big vision, it leaves out all sorts of stuff that's in First Corinthians, right? And it's really important and central to Paul, like the Lord's Supper. So maybe pre-existence, it just wasn't in the exorcism stories, and it wasn't in the sayings of Q, and it wasn't in the passion narrative. It's just not in the materials to hand. And so an author could write a book and it not be there. But I find it hard to think that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them, were ignorant of this idea, which is old by the time they're writing, or that all three of them just happened to agree that it was nonsense. I think either they've given it little thought, or they might have believed it, and it's just not there. Let me do something else. This is more picky, but you're the one who introduced it here. So you're introducing Mark 10. Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. So that's in the Gospel of Mark, right? And Matthew does rewrite that.
Yes.
And I think Luke leaves that story out, doesn't he? Anyway, so what's the deal here? This idea of Jesus's sinlessness is in Paul. He who knew no sin, right? Yep. It's in First Peter, it's in Hebrews, it's in First John. Looks like it's a fairly widespread idea, and Paul probably didn't invent it. So it's an idea that's been around for 2 or 3 decades before Mark. Not only that, but there's a tradition in Judaism of talking about Abraham or the patriarchs or certain exalted people as though they were sinless. All right, there are a couple dozen texts which talk about the sinless or the perfect or blameless people.
I didn't know that. It's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't think, and by the way, if we have these texts which say that Jesus was sinless, I know of no early Christian text that says he was a sinner. So if Mark didn't think he was sinless, as far as I know, he'd probably be the only character. I think it's implicit in Matthew. So for me, this just puzzles me. So does Mark think Jesus is sinless and he just doesn't sense the tension with Mark 10 or being baptized? Jesus baptized for the repentance, baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. That just doesn't bother him. He doesn't put two and two together. Or has he just never thought about it? Anyway, my point is this is really complicated, and I don't have the answer to these things. Matthew, you are right, is editing Mark, and he does it in lots of ways, and John is even a bigger step. But what exactly Mark is thinking, I really don't know.
No, I don't know. We only have words on a page, and we're interpreting through 2,000 years of history and tradition and human experience. I think maybe there might be some answers. I can be bold enough to suggest some.
Okay.
Dare I? What a fool I am. In Luke chapter 1, verse 35, and I mean, we're not going to go into the Greek here, but it's based on the Greek. I've read this in Raymond Brown and Joseph Fitzmyer's comments on this very passage. Their understanding, I think Jimmy Dunn says the same, is that the Greek clearly suggests that the Son is not incarnate, that he is created at that moment. He comes into being. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with this, but that's their exegesis of the Greek. If that is the case, and it seems pretty reasonable to me, then we don't have the pre-existent Jesus here. He not just as qua Jesus, but qua Son comes into existence at that point, according to Luke 1:35. So that would answer the point about, so that would be a response, say, to Paul's pre-existent Son. Luke is saying, no, he came into being at that point, if one goes along with the exegesis of those scholars I mentioned. The other point about Mark 10, I would venture to suggest, and again, this is my own idea, I've not really read this, is that Jesus, I believe Jesus was an eschatological prophet. So I go along with that idea. I think the evidence kind of points mostly in that direction. And Jesus, being a God-fearing, Torah-observant Jew in that context, would, if he was being very pious, shall we say, would have fought shy of the simple attribute of God being applied in this very bland, very clear way to him. Good teacher. He's sort of saying, look, only God is good. It's an expression of humility. it's not an expression. Mark isn't saying thereby that, he's not implying thereby that he believes Jesus is a sinner in any way, shape, or form, but he's recognizing his creaturely status vis-a-vis a holy God. And so he said, don't use this language of me so promiscuously and loosely. Only God is good in that absolute sense. He's kind of making a point. So I don't see that compatible with his sinlessness. Humility as a creature before God can evoke that response. Why do you call me good? Only God is really good. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I have no problem with that at all. But I mean, what we have to do is we have to remember that all this is messy. All right. The reason that we have so many Christological debates is because the data is confusing. If you go and read Athanasius and look at his debates with Arius, Arius is often right, and sometimes Athanasius is right. They're both right and they're both wrong, and it's because the data aren't perfectly clear. And so let me go back to Matthew. So you were very kind at the beginning. I'm supposed to be an expert, so-called expert on Matthew. So if you ask me about Matthew's Christology, which I've been studying and writing about for decades, what do I think? Well, I'm not sure. I really am not sure. So I know what Matthew thinks about Jesus as Messiah, son of David. I think I do. And I think I know what Matthew is up to with Son of Man. But when it comes to the Son language, the Son of God language, I'm really not sure. The gospel ends with baptism in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now that's, wow, that's either Trinitarianism or proto-Trinitarianism, right? So what is that doing in Matthew's gospel? And again, you could ask Matthew what he thought of John, but the question that I've often thought is, what would Matthew do if you sat him down and you said, because you're a time traveler, you said to him, do you think Jesus is God? Now, there are four answers. I've thought about this. There are four answers. One is, of course not. Of course not. The second answer would be, yeah, I think so. The third answer would be, I've never thought about that. That's an interesting question. And you always have to keep that in mind because we're always reading through the 4th century. We're always reading through the creeds. We're always asking questions that maybe these people never asked.
Exactly.
But the fourth response that Matthew might give is, I've been thinking about that for a long time and I can't figure it out. Why do we think these people had clear and distinct ideas about everything, right?
Good point.
Are they like Descartes, clear and distinct idea about this and that? Maybe not. I don't have clear and distinct ideas about everything.
Maybe there's a fifth response, and that'd be my response is, what do you mean by God? Because we have this, clear binary understanding, God's the creator, we're not. But in the ancient world, as you know far better than I, there was a spectrum of understandings. Many different kinds of being were addressed as God, including Moses in Philo, the Jewish writer. In the Bible, the king is addressed in the coronation Psalm 45 as God. Elohim is used of people as well, and let alone in non-canonical Jewish literature. And beyond that, of course, there were sons of gods and divine beings. So to say, is he God, is an incredibly complicated and perplexing question. I don't even know what the question means.
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely right there. And that is, I think, one of the pluses of maybe the last 20 years of scholarship is it's shook us up about this question. The meaning of God is not self-evident within first century Judaism or within the early church. And you have people like Daniel Boyarin, the Jewish scholar, who thinks that some sort of binitarianism is completely Jewish. I mean, he looks at Daniel 7, whether he's right, and he sees the remnant of an old Canaanite myth where the old God gives way to the new God. And he thinks that there are two sorts of divinities here in the text. And that when Jesus and the early Christians plug into that, then
Justin Martyr, the second of the lesser God that Justin Martyr talks about in the 2nd century.
Yeah. So once you have Jesus plugged into this binitarian tradition or scheme, you can go places. So Your question is actually spot on. If I were, which I'm not, if I were to focus on this today, I would be trying to figure out Jewish conceptions of God. And there's a lot of interesting recent work on that, how it evolves, how there are different ideas in the Hebrew Bible, and so on and so on. The rabbis are complicated. Everybody's complicated.
Philo, in his commentaries on the Bible, the language he uses of Moses and so on is extraordinarily exalted. And yet, I don't believe he means that to use our language as a hard metaphysical reality. He's not saying Moses literally Yahweh. He's using Greek language to honor a great man in the way you would honor, I don't know, a sporting hero or celebrity today. It's not meant to be taken in a literal way.
No, but so if you look at Ezekiel the tragedian, so this is before Philo, probably an Alexandrian text also, there is a vision in which Moses appears to sit on the throne of God after God leaves it. And then he seems to hold the scepter of the universe.
Yeah.
And then it looks like he knows the number of stars in the heavens, which is something only God can know. And the angelic hosts bow before him. So that seems to me to be more than just
True.
I don't know what's going on there. Richard Bauckham has argued that, we can't take this literally. It's a dream sequence, but I think it has more than he suspects. But Philo isn't the only person or the only text or source to have exalted ideas about Moses. Actually, the phrase you quoted goes back to Exodus. You will be as a god to Pharaoh, right?
Exodus chapter 7, verse 1, Elohim. Yeah, exactly.
So there are all sorts of stories about Moses, when he's on Sinai, he's actually in heaven, and so on.
But can I just quote just a short paragraph from your this book, page 86, which is kind of relevant, which I thought you bring in the whole global situation. You say, the reverent imaginations of some Jews bestowed omniscience upon Moses and gave him a seat in the heavens. In Mahayana Buddhism, the proclaimer became the proclaimed when some adherents identified Gautama with the absolute deathless reality beyond all things. More to the point, Matthew amended Mark to advance a higher Christology, and ideological tinkering must have gone on from the start. The questions all this raises are obvious and really vexing, to use your word. These are vexatious worries. But no, you bring in the idea of the proclaimer becoming the proclaimed, and that's obviously to do with Jesus. But in other religions, and you're probably aware in Islam as well, during the lifetime of Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, some of Ali's devotees or companions said that they thought he was the incarnation of Allah. This is during Ali's lifetime, and he treated them with predictable, absolutely out of my presence. He would not tolerate that. So this tendency to the apotheosis, the deification of people, even in the lifetime of those individuals. I'm thinking also to Haile Selassie, the Egyptian, Ethiopian, I beg your pardon, statesman, who also was accorded divine honors in his lifetime as well, much to his anger. He didn't tolerate that. So it kind of happens a lot, not just in Judaism. Well,
that's true. Actually, there's an ongoing example in our own time. I don't know if you know much about the Lubavitchers. It's a messianic, messianic Jewish movement. Rabbi Schneerson is their guy, and there was talk of him being Messiah while he was alive, and he didn't say this out loud, but he didn't reject it, so he implicitly accepted it. But since he died, he's actually becoming a cosmic figure. It's really interesting to see how exalted he is. So within a very short time, this happens. Again, I don't know the social psychological reason, but here's why it's not so simple, I think. That is, I don't think that in Jesus's case, I may be wrong, but I don't think it is just post-Easter addenda that's exalting him. I do see things that happen in the tradition, but for good or bad, I think Jesus probably had a striking self-conception. Actually, you can't find any place in the Gospels where he doesn't seem to have himself at the center of the eschatological scenario, or uh, think that he's somebody special.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar got rid of all of the Christology that's in
Yeah.
the Gospels. I don't think that's correct. I think this gets started in part because Jesus already has highfalutin ideas about himself. Uh, Now, I think to think that you are destined to be the king of Israel is to have a high self-conception.
Mm.
Uh, and I think that he also sees himself in Daniel 7, which means that there's the potential there for a lot. My problem is nobody else's problem, but I've never been able to figure out exactly what Son language is doing with Jesus himself. That is, I think it may be connected in part to Davidic messianism, but there are points at which it goes beyond that. Matthew 11, only the Father knows the Son, and only the Son knows the Father. This is a Q text. I mean, it's really as early as we can get.
It's the
And
Johannine bolt from the blue, as it's
yeah,
sometimes called.
what is
Even
it
in John's
doing
Gospel,
there?
in Matthew, why is it
What
there?
is it?
Yeah,
Yeah, what is it? It's in Luke. It's in Q. It's from Q, if you believe in Q.
yeah.
It's a really high Christology. And is it just somebody after Easter say this is a good one? We'll put it in Q, or does it reflect something Jesus was thinking? And just to be candid, I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'm not comfortable simply saying, well, I know that's just added by some tradent of Q. But I'm not really comfortable saying I know Jesus said this. But because of that and some other things, I'm just not sure what to do with the Son language, which means I can't pin down Jesus's self-conception to my own satisfaction. I'm still asking questions. I'm still asking questions after all these
Well,
decades.
absolutely, and they're very, very good. It's not part of the problem. The Gospels we have, we're talking about Matthew, are suffused with the later faith of Christians who are writing in the 80s or 90s AD, a good half century after Jesus. So we're not reading modern biographies, if you like, which at least attempt to, well, can never be disinterested, but at least are trying to provide sources that go back to the origin. We know that Matthew, and this comes back to, not comes back, it moves forward to your book on the resurrection. Is a nice segue now, perhaps into your book here. There's a chapter here, chapter 7, the resurrected holy ones, which absolutely fascinating discussion. This is an extraordinary story at the moment of Jesus' own death, his crucifixion in AD 30. At that point, according to Matthew, the earth shook, and I'm reading here from your translation. The rocks were split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city, and they appeared to many. Now, two extraordinary verses, and you swiftly say, along with virtually all other scholars, apart from Tom Wright, who gets a good whipping in the chapter. No, not a whipping. That's not. That this is fiction. Why is it fiction? Well, because no one else mentions it. The other Gospels don't mention it. Paul doesn't mention it. Acts doesn't mention it. Josephus, the Jewish historian from Jerusalem, doesn't mention it. No one else mentions this. And it was written towards the end of the first century. And if you look, it doesn't make any sense. They're coming out of their graves, and when Jesus dies, utters his last breath, gives up his spirit, they come out of their grave, and they hang around until Sunday, seemingly, and then they go into Jerusalem just down the road. And what are they doing? Are they sitting around? Are they doing other things? What are they doing? And why does no one else mention this? Because, as you rightly say, if this is historical, it's by far the most stupendous and amazing miracle in the entire New Testament, because here you have many people coming out of their graves. And so it really stretches credibility. Now, the reason I mention this, we're talking about Jesus and Christology and so on, is that if, as you rightly say, I think this is legend or myth, and even Mike Licona, who writes a very positive review on the back of your book. Now he teaches at the Houston Baptist University in the USA, a well-known evangelical, conservative evangelical writer and apologist, if that's the right word. Even he now kind of gives up the defense of that, and has come under much criticism from his inerrantist, really conservative colleagues for abandoning this, we must defend it at all costs. But as you say, if this is fiction, once you let the nose of fiction into the tent, I forget the metaphor you use, really the whole body gets in as well, because where do you draw the line? And if Matthew could make stuff up about Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus and resurrection having such an impact seemingly on other dead people, if he makes stories about like that up, how can he be trusted to tell us the God-given gospel truth on everything else?
Well, that's why there's a quest for the historical Jesus. That's why it gets started, or at least why it continues, because people look at the Gospels and they say, well, I can't believe A and I can't believe B. Is there anything else I can believe? And that's why scholars develop methods for separating additions and so on. One of the books you didn't mention that I wrote several years ago is called Constructing Jesus, and it starts out with, given all the problems, given all the obstacles, how do we find the history here behind the text? But this has been going on for 3 centuries now, 4 centuries now.
4 centuries, gosh.
And I'm not a skeptic, so I think it's possible to say lots of things about Jesus, but I think you have to be careful. I think you have to play by the historical rules. I think you have to have an open mind, and there are lots of questions, and you have to conclude at the beginning that there's more than just memory going on here, right? There's more than just unsullied memory going on. By the way, let me elaborate, if you let me do this, just because I wanted to distinguish myself from Mike Licona. Yes. There are a number of evangelicals today who take his view, and what they say is this is part of the theological stage setting of Matthew's gospel. Matthew's not trying to say that this is historical. This is just like all those wonders that the rabbis associate with the death of great rabbis, and Greco-Roman writers associate with the deaths of great human beings. My difference here is that I agree that it didn't happen, but I think Matthew thought it did. I actually argue that Matthew didn't make this up. I think this is a story before Matthew, and that he thinks it happens. And so that's what differentiates me from the more conservative group. And it's why you have the rest of the book. If you look at the gospel accounts and you say you have fiction here and fiction there, then you've got to become an historian. That's it. Right?
But I haven't read, maybe it's a cheeky question because I haven't read it all. What is your conclusion? Do you believe that, do you believe in an objectively mind-independent, resurrected Jesus in some form? And if so, is it more like the Pauline conception, which is this spiritual body, whatever that means? Or is it more like Luke or John, which has a hard corporeal, almost like a resuscitation.
Okay. So no, I'm not in the Luke, John, Tom Wright camp. I'm not in that camp, which is also where Mike Licona is. Yes. I'm more closely related to Pannenberg with a difference. So maybe I'm wrong. I try to be humble about this. But I say that my conclusions within the context of broader New Testament studies are embarrassingly antediluvian, by which I mean I think that somebody named Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. I think some women found the tomb empty. And I think that shortly thereafter, some people saw Jesus alive. Now, my own personal belief, if that's what you're asking for, is that the disciples saw Jesus and Jesus saw them. So I think that he is real, but I don't think he's in a physical body the way you and I are. And as far as the explanation of the empty tomb goes, I simply don't know. If God did it, that's fine with me. If something else happened, that's not the domino that wrecks my faith if that goes. So I have a Jesus who can be encountered, but I think this is in a visionary form. I think that these stories go back to visions. I'm of the opinion that some visions can be veridical. That is, they can have content beyond the subjective imagination of the viewer. And so that's what I say in this book. But as an historian, I try to play devil's advocate, and I don't think the evidence compels you to become a Christian. Here I disagree with my more conservative apologetical friends. I think everything depends upon the framework that you live within and the presuppositions you bring. And what you do with the resurrection depends on everything else you believe. I don't think you can prove that Jesus somehow rose from the dead and then deduce a bunch of things from this. I think it's part of a network of beliefs, and it may inform other beliefs, but it's not a sort of standalone, and it's nothing from which you can derive anything else. Actually, one of the things I do at the end, I'll be interested to see what people do with it, is I say, while resurrection may be at the center of Christian faith, not that much follows from it. By which I mean, it doesn't tell you whether Arius or Athanasius was right. It doesn't tell you what to think about the Bible. It doesn't tell you what to think about the canon. It doesn't tell you whether you should be Eastern Orthodox or a Baptist. I mean, all the differences that Christians hold are held by people who believe Jesus rose from the dead. So believing that doesn't resolve actually any of the interesting theological questions we've been fighting about for 2,000 years.
Although Paul would say, of course, in his letters that an awful lot does ride on this in terms of forgiveness of sin and death itself being defeated and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that it is not the sole epistemological standalone foundation for everything else. Actually, another point here is I know Hindus who think Jesus rose from the dead. It doesn't bother their theology at all. He's an avatar. He's an incarnation of Krishna. He's the same as Krishna. Krishna is Christ. They're having problems with it. So even saying that God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't tell you what religion to belong to. There are Tibetan Buddhists. I have a whole chapter on this weird phenomenon in Tibetan Buddhism of bodies that disintegrate and the masters who then appear and give instructions to their people. I know Tibetan Buddhists who have no trouble with the resurrection narratives. Of course, he achieved what they call rainbow body. Now, they may be totally wrong, but my point is, in the abstract, you can interpret these narratives in the New Testament in any number of ways. And you can read them as a Unitarian. You could read them as a Catholic. You could read them as a Mennonite. So it gives you less than you would hope. Also, if you say God raised Jesus from the dead, you still have to define those two terms. Who the heck is God? Right?
But it's a separate being from Jesus. Then that statement itself, I would suggest, is a Unitarian statement. God raised.
Well, okay. Well, there you go. You think it's a Unitarian statement? Athanasius thought it was a Trinitarian statement, but it doesn't itself tell you who God is. Really, it doesn't, because fundamentalist Baptists who are sending everybody to hell agree with that. And David Bentley Hart, who has everybody in heaven in the afterlife, believes it also.
Yeah.
Right? And also, Jesus isn't a fixed quantity. Who is Jesus? God raised Jesus from the dead. Well, we've got the quest for the historical Jesus. Whose Jesus is this? Is this the Jesus of the canon? Is this the Jesus of the synoptics? Is this the Jesus of an historian? Really, I'm not trying to be overcritical or deconstructive here. But if you think critically, this is very complicated, and it's just not so simple, right?
Just a slightly cheeky question. You're a Presbyterian minister, and you are in the seminary you work at. You are preparing the future pastors and ministers and priests, in the parishes around the states. what is their takeaway from this? Now, I know intellectually what a takeaway, you've explained it, but in terms of actual pastors of souls preaching on a Sunday, what are they to say? They can't say it's all very complicated and it depends on, do you want the synoptic Jesus, do you want the Johannine Jesus, do you want the historian's Jesus, do you want this, that? You can't preach that from the pulpit, can you? Or maybe you can. I mean,
no, no. And first of all, I say in this book that I do a little theology, but this is an historian's book. So this is an exercise in the limits of historical criticism. It's not really theology. And what a theologian would make of it, well, that's up to the theologian. I'm only an amateur theologian. I'm not a professional theologian. So I don't do that. But the thing for me is that this is not the only fact or series of facts that goes to make up your Christian universe. There are all sorts of other things to ponder and think about. My next book has nothing to do with this. Absolutely nothing. My next book is a book on religious experience, and there's no overlap between the two, or very little overlap between the two. I think this subject is important, but there are also other subjects that are very important. So are
you updating William James, by the way? Are you writing a 21st century William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience?
Well, the title of the book is The Persistence of Religious Experience. So that's an homage to William James, and he is one of my intellectual heroes. I think he was a great intellect, a great person. And he's one of those people, every time I read him, whether I'm reading a chapter from a book or an essay, I take something important away. I think he was above the rest of us in several ways.
He's there with Schweitzer as one of the mutants of humankind.
Yeah, he's a mutant, and we all stand on the shoulders of mutants to rewrite Newton.
Yes, indeed, very good. I was going to say that. Now, so just a final point. How then do your students who are becoming professors integrate their experience then? Okay, they've got the historical Jesus, they've got the religious experiences. How do they come out as rounded people who can preach to and pastor to people? I don't get it. It seems too fragmented and too unconnected to be a coherent. I don't know.
So we have lots of students who just ignore me, and that's fine. They take me in the introduction and they never see me again because they don't know what to make of it. So this strange new world is one that they exit. Then I have other students who take classes with me on the historical Jesus, and then I just tell them that I'm only one teacher and I'm one point of view, and it's their job to take whatever they've learned and spend the rest of their lives trying to put things together. Now, maybe that's not fair, maybe that's too hard, but it's what was left to me, and I don't know anything else to say. I don't have the easy answers. I also tell them I'm one faculty member, and this is a seminary, and there are 40 of us, and you need to listen to all of us and figure out what you buy and what works and what doesn't. And of course, in the end, it is up to them anyway. A seminary curriculum is, in its modern form, it's a smorgasbord. You get to decide, apart from the required classes, what you're going to take. And if people don't like what I'm selling, they don't come.
But is that not just? I mean, I get your point. Seriously, that's fair enough. By the way, I'm not. That's fair enough. But is it just a slight whiff of postmodernism about that? That there is these different truths, and we're all just in a sea of relative epistemologies, and we never quite know where we're going. Is there not a little bit of that in the background of postmodernist sort of?
I don't think I'm a postmodernist. What I would hope is that I'm modest and humble, and that's it. I'm not a postmodernist. And so what I share with students is the book you started with, the book, The Historical Christ. They read that in one of my classes. They
still read this today? So
I just taught a class, and they have to read it, and they have to write an analysis of every chapter in that book. Right.
Gosh.
So that book's the best I can do, Paul. That is, I don't have all the answers. Maybe somebody else does. That's fine. I don't. I don't have some giant idea that puts it all together. I just work on this, and then I work on that, and I think about this, and it's for other people to put everything together.
Wow.
Right. And I just share my struggles with them. And, one of the things I do usually is I write a book and then I just go on. I don't defend it. I'm not really interested in the conversations that come from it. I've just given it my best shot. And it's up to everybody else to figure out whether there's anything worthwhile or not. And then I'm just on to the next subject.
Oh, extraordinary. Absolutely fascinating insight into everything there. Just finally then, on a completely different subject, and this is out of the blue, so forgive me, but do you think that Muhammad was a prophet of God?
Do I think Muhammad was a prophet of God? So I'm going to weasel out of that to say I'm not an expert, and I would say it's quite possible.
Right.
I really like Justin Martyr's idea of the spermaticos logos, the idea of a universal word, of God communicating to all people. And the idea doesn't bother me at all.
Right. So the idea of a prophet outside of the Jewish stream of prophets coming to different people in another part of the world preaching a similar message is not problematic, obviously.
No, actually, I love the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
I love certain Hindu texts. I love the old Greek philosophers. So I have Justin's view that wherever you find truth, you can attribute it to the logos. So
that's like Vatican II, isn't it? Vatican II said something quite similar, I think.
It's a little Vatican II, right? I'm not happy with the anonymous Christian language. That's still interpreting everybody in your terms. And the logos thing is a little less of that. I mean, it's still my term, but it's a little less than that.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes from the Stoics ultimately. So I'm reading everybody through the Stoics.
Well, it's all mixed up. So when is your next book due to be published, or have you finished it, I should say?
I am finishing it this summer. It'll be out next year.
Right. And will it be similar to William James's? I mean, will it investigating the diversity of religious experiences in an empirical way, because he was an empiricist, obviously, or are you going to be more reflective and theological in your...
I'm going to be both. So it's empirical. I'm looking empirically at a set of 6 or 7 recurrent experiences, types of experiences, things that happen fairly frequently to people, even if we don't talk about them that much. And then I'm trying to theorize about them. I ask questions about the theology. But I'll tell you what my main agenda is. My main agenda is that we still live in a world, less than we used to, but we still live in a world in which a number of people have extraordinary experiences and feel an implicit censorship.
Yes.
That is, they may have a mystical experience or an encounter with, they think an evil spirit or something. And given their Christian context, maybe their Protestant context or their secular context or whatever, they can't talk to people and they don't know that other people have had this experience and that there's a literature on it and so on. So this is an attempt to destigmatize or further destigmatize a number of experiences that still get stigmatized in my experience in many religious circles, even though the people who have them regard them as maybe life-changing, profound religious experiences. I've had some experiences of my own that you might want to call mystical, and they were pretty much private my whole life because I just had nobody to talk to about them. I just didn't run into people. And that's one of the reasons I've always loved William James. I said, oh, here's somebody who sees a lot of things the way I do. He understands me better than my pastor does.
And he doesn't. Right? William James doesn't judge the people. No matter how whether it be an ordinary laborer, in New York State in the 19th, he doesn't judge these people. He recounts them respectfully, tells their story, and lets the reader judge. And I think that's a true kind of scientific approach.
That's scientific. But I also, there's a further step there. James rejects what he calls medical materialism.
Yes.
So he was not a reductionist. I'm also an open-minded person who is not a medical materialist.
Yeah.
And this book also includes some arguments for a non-reductionistic view of some experiences.
Okay. And what about near-death experiences? Because these were experiences that some people had for a long, long time, and that they didn't want to speak about them for fear of being thought crazy, or they were just illusions. And yet these are powerful, life-transforming experiences. And particularly in the recent years now, there's a burgeoning literature, peer-reviewed, even scientific literature now, in many, many people have had this globally. It's not just Americans, it's Chinese and everyone else. And some of these accounts are, I don't mean just the spectacular divine ones, but where people have out-of-body experience and are able to accurately tell when they're revived exactly what happened around them, who said what and what happened. These seem to have a great credibility to my eyes now, and there's a burgeoning literature, as I say, and people are perhaps coming out of the closet and saying, I had an NDE, and I'm not insane, and other people have now. And did you cover that in your book? That's
there's a whole chapter on that. I am familiar with the literature, and I take the theologians to the woodshed at that point, because in our culture at this time and place, when you ask people what they think of the afterlife, this actually is the first thing that comes to mind. And if the theologians ignore this, they are just being irrelevant in my judgment. So I think this is a huge mistake. And I think we've reached the point where we need to take these seriously. Yes. One of the things I do is I think there are about 10 of them, maybe 11 or 12, where I found in the sources testimonies from doctors who were in surgery, and the patient woke up and told them things. And in each case, the surgeon or the neurologist or the anesthesiologist or the nurse says, I can't figure this out. They can't possibly have known this. And my question is, how many of these does it take before we decide there really is something here? And my claim is we've probably crossed that threshold.
Absolutely. I had exactly that thought several years ago, that we've crossed that threshold. The evidence, the empirical evidence from very respected sources, surgeons, neurosurgeons, doctors, these are not wacky people who've said over and over again, how could they have known this? What we need is a paradigm shift, the Thomas Kuhn thing, a paradigm shift. We need to move away from this reductionist, materialist understanding of the psyche to perhaps a more what I would call idealist understanding. But this is pregnant, waiting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet in our culture.
But the theologians are also behind here. So one of the things I try to argue there is that it may be a bit like Genesis. So I say it used to be, when we talked about the creation and the beginning of the world, everything that came before. We used to have the Bible, and it was the property of the theologians. But eventually they said, well, we got to pay attention to the scientists. We've got to pay attention to the cosmologists. We can't just read Genesis anymore. But they're still just reading theological texts, and they're ignoring this stuff, which may actually at some point begin to say a few things about what might lie beyond. And they shouldn't be ignoring it. They need to figure out how to interpret it theologically. And I think they're derelict in their duties if they don't start doing this. There are some recent books on Christian eschatology which pay no attention to this. They're just not there, as though it's weird to me. And so, I'm on board with you there. I'm enthusiastically on board.
I'm so pleased. I didn't know you were writing this. I'm certainly going to get that because this is one of my hobby horses. This quite public denial of the relevancy and the significance of what's happening. And as I said, this is becoming really well researched and quantified now. This is no longer just hearsay that crazy people have when they've had a near-death experience. There's that guy in New York, the professor of neuropsychiatry, I forget his name, who himself had a near-death experience. And he was a skeptic, a materialist before it. And now he's a great advocate of the reality of this. And he applied skepticism and scientific doubt, methodological doubt to his own experience to try and find explanations of neurological explanations. And he concluded, no, this is absolutely real in an objective, mind-independent sense. So he converted, and he's on top of I think he's at Harvard or Yale or something. He's a professor there. So, some serious players are coming, and not just yourself, but some scientists too.
Yep. I don't know what to say. Amen.
Amen. Amen. I like that. I said something and you said amen. Good. I'm pleased. All right. Well, I guess we ought to conclude now. I mean, is there anything else you wanted just to say in conclusion about your work or what you're working on, or to correct anything I might have said that was
No,
misleading?
you didn't get anything wrong. No, I'm happy for you to have me, and I can say this. I suppose this is shameless self promotion, but I really like my book on resurrection. You know, books are not like children. When you have children, you love them all
Yeah.
equally. But some of my books I like better than others. I really like this book. I think it's good, and I think it's interesting.
But
And
why is it your favorite child, if you want to have a favorite child, compared to all your other many works? What's so special about this book then?
I really have been thinking about this subject since the 1970s, and relentlessly, I've been thinking about this. think, gosh, I think I know the secondary literature on this as well as anybody ever. I tried to read everything.
Wow.
And it's got lots of stuff you won't find anywhere else
Mm.
that isn't in the literature, that isn't discussed in the literature. So I think it's a lot of fun, and it's different. It's not polemics. It's not apologetics.
No.
It's history with a lot of weird things thrown on top of it.
That sounds like your writing in a positive way. It's very readable. It's not dull. I guess a lot of New Testament scholars can be rather dry, dare I say. But, your writing is never like that, and it's quite eclectic. It tends to draw on a lot of feels, a lot of thoughts. You pull in stuff from all over the place, and it's a potpourri of. It's a feast for the mind quite often, and if I may put it that way.
That's lovely to hear. By the way, when I was small, what I wanted to be when I grew up was a writer, and I've never been able to be a writer, by which I mean just sitting down at your desk every day and doing nothing else. That's really what I would have done with my life if I could have. Anyway, I care about sentences, and my favorite part of writing is not producing the book. It's actually going back and rewriting sentences at the end to make them sound right. That's my favorite part of writing a book. So I should have been a writer. I'm a failure in life.
No, you're not. You're not. Of course, you're not. No, I can see what you mean. You're not just a dry academic who's having to churn out the stuff. There's a creativity and fecundity about your work, which that makes a lot of.
You've just
wow. Well, thank you so much indeed, sir. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, you've just frozen there.
Yeah, I just froze for a second, but we're okay now, aren't we?
Yeah, maybe it's the weather across the Atlantic. Yeah, no, we're fluid. There was a little.
Okay, yeah, we did. We froze for a few seconds there, but anyway, thank you so much for having me. This was enjoyable.
And you too. Thank you very much. I'm sure the viewers will love it. And keep writing, because you're one of those scholars who actually entertains as well as informs, and that's an interesting, unusual combination. So thank you so much, Dale, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.